You want to stay informed, right? Keep up with the big stories without feeling like you're drowning in news all the time.
Yeah, it's tough to keep track.
Okay, so let's unpack this one. That's exactly why we're here. We take the key info, the crucial details, and give you the shortcut to understanding what really matters.
Today, we're definitely diving deep into something pretty significant in South Korean politics. That's the recent indictment of Lee Jae-myung.
Exactly. We're focusing specifically on his indictment tied to the Ssangbangul illegal money transfer situation involving North Korea. Now, the main source we're drawing from today is a really detailed transcript from KBS News on YouTube, dated June 12, 2024. It lays out the indictment pretty clearly.
Yeah, it's quite thorough. And we've got other materials too, right, for broader context.
We do, yeah. News articles, background on some related controversies, just to flesh things out a bit.
Okay, so our mission today, basically, is to get right to the heart of this indictment. We want to understand the specific allegations, the legal thinking behind the charges, and really crucially, what this all might mean for Lee Jae-myung's future, both legally and politically.
And we're sticking close to the sources, grounding it all in the facts presented there.
Absolutely.
All right, let's jump right in then. What are the central allegations? What's the core of this indictment?
So it really boils down to charges of what's called third-party bribery. Specifically, Lee Jae-myung's been indicted over Ssangbangul transferring a pretty hefty sum, $8 million, to North Korea.
$8 million. Wow, okay, that's serious money. What does the prosecution claim that money was actually for?
Well, their argument breaks it down. They say $5 million of it was essentially a down payment or maybe an initial payment for North Korea's promise to back Gyeonggi Province's Smart Farm project.
Okay, the Smart Farm project. And the rest, the other $3 million.
That other $3 million, according to the prosecution, was specifically earmarked for expenses related to a planned visit by Lee Jae-myung himself to North Korea. This was back when he was the governor of Gyeonggi Province.
A visit he was planning. And when did the prosecution say Lee Jae-myung asked Ssangbangul to pay for all this?
Their investigation suggests North Korea first asked Lee for these funds back in 2019. And following that, the prosecution alleges Lee then turned around and asked Ssangbangul to cover these costs.
Now, this feels connected to something else we heard about recently involving someone else who worked with Lee.
Exactly. You're probably thinking of Lee Jae-myung. He was the vice governor of Gyeonggi Province under Lee Jae-myung.
Right.
He was indicted on the very same third-party bribery charges related to this money transfer. And just recently, he was sentenced, wasn't he?
Yeah, I think I saw that. 9.5 years.
That's right. 9.5 years in prison for his role in this whole North Korea money transfer affair. So Lee Jae-myung's indictment definitely follows on from that case.
Okay, third-party bribery. That term keeps coming up. It sounds like the key legal concept here. How exactly does the prosecution frame that argument? What makes it third-party?
So the logic is that the bribe wasn't paid directly to Lee Jae-myung for his own pocket. Instead, it was paid to a third party, North Korea, in this case, but allegedly for the benefit of Lee Jae-myung, or the entity he represented, Gyeonggi Province.
Ah, okay, so the benefit wasn't direct cash to him, but something else he wanted.
Precisely. And the prosecution argues Ssangbangul wasn't just doing this out of, generosity. They contend Ssangbangul expected something significant in return.
Like what? What did Ssangbangul supposedly expect?
They argue Ssangbangul was anticipating substantial support and various guarantees from Gyeonggi Province for their own business plans in North Korea. So the payments were seen as like an investment expecting a future return from the provincial government.
Okay, so a sort of quid pro quo. Ssangbangul pays North Korea, Gyeonggi Province helps Ssangbangul's business later?
That's the essence of the prosecution's case. And they lean heavily on testimony from Kim Song-tae. He's the former chairman of Ssangbangul.
Right. His testimony came up in the Lee Jae-myung trial.
It did. Kim Song-tae reportedly testified that there was a clear incentive, a reason, for Ssangbangul to pay for Lee Jae-myung's potential North Korea trip.
And that incentive was?
The expectation of Gyeonggi Province's backing for Ssangbangul's North Korea ventures. That was the alleged payoff for Ssangbangul.
Let's dig into that planned North Korea visit a bit more. Why was that considered such a big deal?
Well, the court in Lee Jae-myung's trial actually acknowledged this. They found that, yes, part of that $8 million from Ssangbangul was intended to help make Lee Jae-myung's visit happen.
They even called some of it a success fee, didn't they?
They did, yeah. A success fee linked to the possibility of that visit, which, sounds a bit unusual for diplomacy, maybe.
It does raise an eyebrow. What made the court think Lee Jae-myung was so keen on this visit?
The court inferred he really wanted to go. They pointed to something specific. Back in 2018, there was this big inter-Korean summit.
I remember that.
The mayor of Seoul, Park Won-soon at the time, was included in the special delegation, but Lee Jae-myung, the governor of Gyeonggi Province, which borders North Korea, was notably left out.
Ah, okay. So that might have stung politically.
That's the suggestion. And apparently this exclusion put a lot of pressure on Lee Jae-myung, the vice governor, to make sure Lee Jae-myung got his own chance to visit North Korea later. Sort of a makeup opportunity, perhaps?
So boosting his profile on the inter-Korean stage.
That seems to be the implication, and it gets even more dramatic. There was testimony about an alleged offer made to Lee Jae-myung, supposedly relayed through Lee Jae-myung by a North Korean official.
An offer? What kind of offer?
Get this, a state visit, complete with a modern helicopter, and supposedly an even grander welcome than President Moon Jae-in had received.
A helicopter? Wow, okay, that paints a picture of a very high-stakes, potentially very prestigious trip he was supposedly aiming for.
Definitely suggests it wasn't just a casual meet and greet being discussed.
All right, so we have the core allegations, this third-party bribery logic, and the importance placed on that potential visit. What about the evidence? What key testimony is the prosecution relying on most heavily?
A really central piece is the testimony from Kim Song-tae, the former Ssangbangul chairman we mentioned. He gave very consistent and quite specific testimony about phone calls.
Phone calls with Lee Jae-myung.
Yes. Calls he claims he had with Lee Jae-myung personally, right around the time these payments were being made to North Korea. He mentioned a specific call in July 2019.
July 2019. What was significant about that one?
That's when the $5 million for the Smart Farm project was supposedly transferred. Kim testified that Lee Jae-myung handed him the phone, and he spoke directly with Lee Jae-myung.
Okay, that's a very direct claim. And what's Lee Jae-myung's response been to that specific allegation?
He denies it flat out. Says he never met Kim Song-tae, and he has absolutely no memory of any such phone calls happening.
But didn't the court in the first trial, Lee Jae-myung's trial, address Kim Song-tae's credibility?
It did. And crucially, the court explicitly stated that they found Kim Song-tae's testimony believable. His account was deemed credible by the judges in that case.
Which obviously is not great news for Lee Jae-myung's defense in this case.
No, it definitely gives the prosecution's narrative a significant boost heading into Lee's own trial.
Now, during Lee Jae-myung's trial, were there alternative explanations presented for why Ssangbangul sent money to North Korea?
Yes, there was a counterargument. Lee Jae-myung's defense team suggested the money transfers were actually part of a scheme related to stock price manipulation by Ssangbangul.
Stock manipulation. How did the court view that argument?
The court wasn't convinced. They basically said the defense didn't provide enough specific details to back up that claim.
Right.
They also raised some questions about documents from the National Intelligence Service, the NIS, that were presented. The court seemed unsure about how thoroughly the NIS had verified the information in those documents related to the stock manipulation angle.
The NIS, South Korea's main intelligence agency, right? So the court had doubts about their info in this context.
It appears so, yes. They questioned the verification process, which kind of undercut the reliability of those NIS documents as proof for the stock manipulation theory in the court's eyes.
So faced with Kim Song-tae's consistent testimony on one side and this less convincing stock manipulation argument on the other.
Exactly. The court found the testimony from Kim and other Ssangbangul executives more persuasive. They sided with the prosecution's interpretation of the payments being linked to Gyeonggi province and Lee Jae-myung's potential visit.
Okay, so Lee Jae-myung's trial set a lot of this up, but it didn't actually decide if Lee Jae-myung knew about the payments, did it?
That is the absolute crucial point here. The first trial convicted Lee Jae-myung, but it did not make a legal finding on whether Lee Jae-myung himself was informed about Ssangbangul paying North Korea on his behalf, so to speak.
So that's the $1 million question, or maybe the $8 million question, for his upcoming trial.
Precisely. That's going to be the central point of contention, you can be sure of that. Did he know? Did he direct it? That's what his trial will focus on.
All right, so the indictment is official now. How has Lee Jae-myung himself reacted publicly?
He's come out swinging, really. He dismissed the whole indictment as a badly written novel, basically calling it fiction.
Strong words. And what about his party, the Democratic Party? Are they backing him up?
Oh, absolutely. They're fully behind him, echoing his claims. They're calling it blatant political prosecution.
Political prosecution. That means they think it's politically motivated, not purely legal.
Yes, that's the allegation. They believe the timing and the charges are designed to damage him politically. And they're not just talking, they're planning action. They've announced plans to file complaints against key people involved in the investigation, alleging witness tampering. Plus, they're pushing hard for a special prosecutor to take over the case, and also for a separate parliamentary investigation.
So they're really fighting back on multiple fronts. What's the view from the other side, the ruling party, the People Power Party?
Their take is, well, completely different, as you'd expect. They see this indictment as inevitable, basically saying Lee Jae-myung's alleged past actions are catching up with him. They frame it as his legal risks finally becoming reality.
And are they criticizing the Democratic Party's response?
Yes, strongly. They've accused the Democrats of trying to undermine the judicial system itself with their calls for special prosecutors and probes, suggesting it's an attack on judicial independence. It really highlights the deep political divide over this case.
And this indictment, it doesn't exist in a vacuum, does it? Lee Jae-myung has other legal battles going on.
That's right. This is actually the fourth concurrent trial he's now facing. It adds another major legal challenge to his plate.
4 trials at once. Goodness. What are the other 3 about?
The others involve alleged violations of election laws and also separate perjury charges, so a mix of issues.
And these other cases, are they likely to wrap up soon?
Well, verdicts in those election law and perjury trials are actually expected sometime within this year, so things could move relatively quickly on those fronts, making this a really critical period for him.
What happens if he gets negative verdicts in those cases? What are the potential consequences?
They could be very severe. In the election law case, for example, if he receives a fine of $1 million or more, which is roughly, $750, $800, and it's upheld by the Supreme Court,
Yes.
he automatically loses his seat in the National Assembly. He'd also be barred from running for office again for a period.
Wow. And anything else?
Yes. His party, the Democratic Party, would have to pay back a huge chunk of election funds. They receive something like 43.4 billion won. That's a massive financial hit.
Okay. And the perjury case. Similar consequences.
Pretty similar, yeah. If he gets a jail sentence, even if it's suspended, and that's confirmed by the highest court, he'd also lose his parliamentary seat and his eligibility to run for office.
So his entire political career could potentially be on the line with these verdicts this year. What does all this mean for his presidential ambitions? He's widely seen as a potential candidate for 2027.
Well, it casts a huge shadow, obviously. If any of these convictions are finalized by the Supreme Court before, say, March 2027, which is usually when the presidential race starts heating up, it could make him ineligible to even run. It's a major hurdle.
And even if the cases are still ongoing, there's that tricky issue of presidential immunity, right? Article 84.
Exactly. If he were to run and win the presidency while these trials are still active, Article 84 of the Constitution would come into play. It says a sitting president generally can't be prosecuted for most crimes.
But can trials that started before he became president continue?
That's the big legal debate. It's quite ambiguous, and you can bet there would be intense legal and political fights over whether his trials would have to be paused during his term. It's uncharted territory, really.
And we haven't even mentioned the Dae-jang scandal. That's still looming too, isn't it?
Oh, yes, that's the other massive legal case hanging over him. The Dae-jang development scandal is incredibly complex. We're talking about like a mountain of case files.
Hundreds of thousands of pages, I heard.
Potentially, yeah. And tons of witnesses, probably over 100. Given that sheer scale, everyone expects the Dae-jang trial to drag on for a very, very long time. It's not ending anytime soon.
Okay, so let's try to wrap our heads around this.
Yeah.
We've got Lee Jae-myung indicted now for third-party bribery. It's linked to Ssangbangul sending $8 million to North Korea. The prosecution says this was for a smart farm project and, crucially, for Lee's own planned visit to Pyongyang, which never actually happened.
Right, that's their core narrative.
We've discussed the conflicting testimonies, especially between Lee and the former Ssangbangul chair, Kim Song-tae. And we know Lee Jae-myung, the former vice governor, was already convicted on related charges.
And importantly, Kim Sung-tae's testimony was found credible in that first trial.
Right. And now Lee faces this, alongside 3 other trials, with potentially career-ending consequences hanging on verdicts expected soon, all while the massive Dae-jang-dong case grinds on in the background. It's a lot.
It is a very complex and precarious situation for him. And just to reiterate that key point from earlier, Lee Jae-myung's trial didn't actually determine if Lee Jae-myung knew about the payments.
That remains the central unanswered question for his own trial.
Exactly. That's what his defense and the prosecution will be battling over, proving his knowledge and intent, or lack thereof.
You know, looking at this whole picture, the indictment, the alleged reasons for the payments, the political reactions, the other legal cases, it really does feel like a tangled web.
It really does.
It makes you think, doesn't it? What is this whole saga, regardless of how the trials ultimately end? Tell us about the intersection of politics in South Korea, the tricky business of engaging with North Korea, and maybe the role powerful companies sometimes play behind the scenes.
That's a really good question to ponder. It touches on so many sensitive nerves: political ambition, inter-Korean policy, corporate influence, the justice system. There are layers upon layers here.
Definitely something to keep watching and thinking about as this unfolds. There are clearly huge stakes involved, personally for Lee Jae-myung, but also politically for South Korea.